Good evening and welcome to the Planning Commission meeting for May 7th, 2025. I am Chair Huxford. I will call the meeting to order and ask for you to join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you so much. It's been a minute since we met last, and I've missed you, and I've looked forward to reconvening to move forward this city agenda. I will ask at this point that we have a roll call. We'll start with you, Commissioner Packard.
Present.
Commissioner Morton.
Here.
Commissioner Jennifer Davis. Here. We have a commissioner joining us online. Has she joined us yet? Okay, so with 4 in the room, we are missing at this point Commissioner Connor Davis, although we expect him to join us momentarily. We have one of our commissioners that will join us online momentarily. And we do have an excused absence. Commissioner Dewar has asked for an excused absence. Do I have a motion to approve?
Commissioner Packard motions to approve.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, Commissioner Dewar, thank you so much for your service to our commission and to your time away in honor of
Free time.
Sorry,
yes.
Commissioner Nass emailed just now and said she's not feeling well.
Okay. So we do have a second motion or a second commissioner that's unavailable this evening. Do I have a motion to
I move to excuse Commissioner Matz.
thank you. Do we have a second on that?
I second.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Again, we have a, and we're not voting on anything this evening, but it's a informative information sort of meeting. We want to make sure that we've got enough commissioners that we are fulfilling our duties, and we have done so. So with your permission, I'm going to give Commissioner Connor Davis a few more minutes to join us. Otherwise, obviously, we will be recorded for anybody that wants to follow up with us at another time. Let's move forward. Do we have any guest business? Is there any guest business online?
No.
I see none in the audience, so we will move forward from there. Do we have any action items other than the minutes? Were all the commissioners available to read and approve the minutes? This was from March 5th. This went back a bit. So we had to review our notes. And were there any edits or changes that you wanted to see from those minutes?
Nope.
Hearing none, do I have a motion to approve?
I move to approve the minutes from the March 5th meeting.
So Commissioner Morton approves those. Do I have a second?
Commissioner Packard seconds.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstain? Okay, those minutes are approved from March 5th. Thank you so much. Again, we have to renew a little bit our timelines, as does the city, I think. And that was very helpful in going back in time. So we are now up to action item 5 on the agenda. These are the discussion items for tonight's meeting. We are going to move on to an overview and examples of critical aquifer recharge area. Those regulations will be discussed by David Levitan.
All right. Thank you, Chair Huxford. David Levitan, Principal Planner. So tonight, we've obviously had a couple meetings off, and so we wanted to come back together just to touch on some of the code work that staff is working on. Most of these items are implementation items for the 2024 comprehensive plan. Basically, a lot of the items that have been incorporated into the last few Washington state legislative sessions related to things like design review and housing. And we're going to come back with some additional items in future meetings just to give an update on those. And then also wanted to start the meeting tonight we are required by the end of the year to update our critical areas ordinance. In general, we're in a pretty good spot when it comes to things like wetlands and streams, geologically hazardous areas. Our code is generally already reflecting best available science. There are a couple areas where we're currently lacking as far as our regulations, as far as compliance with the Growth Management Act. And one of those is going to be the focus of tonight's meeting, and that is critical aquifer recharge areas. So I just wanted to get into a little bit more in depth on that. We had introduced those back at the end of February, just as far as the critical areas ordinance update. So wanted to focus on CARAs as they're known. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and just do okay. Don, can you allow me to share there? All right. All right, so just a little bit of an overview since this might be new to some. So critical aquifer recharge areas are basically areas within the city or adjacent areas that have a critical or recharging effect on aquifers used for potable water. So basically the intent of these is to protect groundwater supply that's used as drinking water. They are identified as critical areas within the Growth Management Act, so we are required to address them through our local critical areas ordinance. And as mentioned, a lot of this information is relatively recent, so it wasn't reflected in the last major update to the CAO, which occurred back in 2019. So now we are bringing our critical areas ordinance into compliance specifically related to these CARAs. So the goal of establishing CARAs is to protect the functions and values of groundwater supply by preventing pollution and maintaining supply throughout what are called wellhead protection areas. So basically the concept is you have wells that supply groundwater to certain parts of the city and adjacent areas, and there need to be some sort of protection to make sure that there isn't contamination, that there aren't land uses that potentially disrupt and contaminate the supply of groundwater within these areas. So that's what these wellhead protection areas or wellhead protection zones are. They're generally categorized depending on what's kind of the travel time potential of contaminants. Basically, how long would it take for contaminants to move from adjacent areas and potentially affect these adjacent groundwater supplies. And so generally the higher the category, so a category 1 would generally be if there's a short travel time, if it wouldn't take very long for potential contaminants to move and affect adjacent groundwater supplies, that would be kind of at the high end. And then as the travel time, basically how long it would take to contaminate adjacent groundwater supplies, as that time gets larger and the distance farther and the number of users affected fewer, you generally have lower category of critical aquifer recharge areas.
Can you clarify something for me? The 6 month, 1 year, 5 year, is that a function of the ease of the water being able to move, or is it a function of the contaminant itself and how transferable that contaminant is?
Yeah, it kind of factors in both. Kind of the primary is the ease of travel, how, it would be affected by topography, it would be affected by the types of soils, it would be affected by the depth of the aquifer. So you're required to update your best available science, and we'll get into that a little bit more, to basically do a comprehensive assessment of the soils, of the topography, of the land uses, and how easily and how you're going to categorize these CARAs is dependent on a bunch of different factors that are reflected. And we're in the process of finalizing a contract with a consultant to help us out. A lot of their focus is going to be on CARAs, just because they have some expertise that we don't have, really help us with the mapping so that we can very clearly show where these areas are and how that might influence land use regulations in adjacent areas. And then they're also going to be helping us with some updates to riparian areas, which we touched on a little bit at the end of February, and which we'll bring back some additional updates on as we start to work on that component of the critical areas update. So where are their cars located in the city? So the Snohomish County, they did their critical areas ordinance update. They started a little bit earlier than us, so they've done a fair amount of their mapping. So this is areas in the very northeast corner of the city. So the green dots are basically what are known as Group A water sources. So those are groundwater supplies with 15 or more connections. So that's kind of the primary focus of CARA regulations, or at least the highest level of focus is those water systems that are used by more users as opposed to fewer users. And so these are the mapped, the green dots are the mapped water sources that serve at least 15 connections within the areas just outside of the city, then an unincorporated portion of Snohomish County. And then the blue circle that surrounds it, according to the county's best available science, are basically the wellhead protection area. And that has been categorized as a 10-year. So basically how long it would take, kind of the distance within basically anything within the blue, it would potentially within 10 years affect those water supplies. We are going to need to do a city-specific best available science review for CARAs. Obviously, we potentially have some wells. They're generally not served by a whole lot of users, but we are required to update our best available science as well. And so that's what the consulting firm is going to help us out on. So we're going to be updating that over the next few months. And then that kind of from there, you have to do a general assessment of what are the ground conditions, specifically the groundwater supply conditions within these areas, and how can they be potentially affected by adjacent land uses. That's the general concept with critical aquifer recharge areas, is how do you regulate land uses? How do you provide environmental protection so that you can minimize and as needed mitigate potential impacts on groundwater supply? And so how do jurisdictions regulate CARAs? There's kind of a multi-pronged approach. So there are specific uses depending on their proximity, depending on the travel time to adjacent water systems. There are uses that can be prohibited. There are uses that can be established with special conditions. Typically, the critical aquifer recharge code would require the preparation of a hydrogeologic report if somebody wants to do a use within one of these wellhead protection areas. And then similar to other critical areas, kind of the sequencing is avoidance is obviously preferred, then minimizing potential impacts, and then mitigation. So that's part of the best available science review, is making sure that we're generally compliant with that critical area sequencing and making sure that we are minimizing potential impacts on these groundwater supplies. And so these are just a couple of examples. The one on the top shows prohibited uses within Snohomish County's critical aquifer recharge area code. And then the one on the bottom shows some special restrictions within the city of Edmonds, so regulated activities there. So for example, it's hard to see there, but automotive uses and dry cleaning. A lot of times this is, the regulations can even vary depending on your connection to the water system, your connection to the sewer system. If you're obviously on public sewer and you're going through all sorts of environmental regulations related to the permitting on that, you're going to have less of a potential impact on these uses than if you have a drain field and you have a heavy industrial use, then that has the potential for much more environmental impact than somebody that's, say, on the sanitary sewer system.
So dry cleaners, they're dumping their chemicals, are they?
They're not. And so generally, even within that, so this one, they generally, if there's a specific type of chemical used, they still might be either regulated or prohibited. this is the one down there on the bottom is from the city of Edmonds, and that was specifically, this is a kind of in the southern part of the city, within the purview of the Olympic View Water District. And I think some of this, the city agreed to be rather conservative in their land uses. It's not much of a problem because almost this entire area within Edmonds is zoned residential. It doesn't allow commercial uses anyway, so it's a little bit of a moot point. But within ours, where it's adjacent to the industrial area, then we're probably going to have a little bit more consideration and really try to balance economic development with environmental protection and think about ways that we can potentially mitigate impacts if we don't want to outright prohibit. It's not necessarily that we want dry cleaning uses within our industrial areas, but there are going to be uses that might be, appropriate within an industrial area that we need to figure out how do we balance those protections against the land uses that we want to see within that area.
So they're prohibiting dry cleaning establishments, assuming that they're dumping, even though dumping is illegal.
They are doing it based on the presence, it appears, of those specific chemicals. And again, I think it's largely because that entire area is zone residential. So I think it was a bit of a moot point. I'd have to dig into that one a little bit more. But that's the general concept, is that we need to analyze the site conditions first, and then it's kind of dovetailing the site conditions with the city's economic development needs, with the permitted land uses, and how do we regulate all of
I
those
would think
things.
also we'd want to consider the existing regulations that prevent businesses that participate in those activities.
Could be a consideration of accidental spillage.
You do, and that would be part of your best available science. Are there adequate regulations in place to mitigate potential impacts? If this area is already served, if it's, if there haven't been any demonstrated issues with, dumping or contamination, that potentially lowers the risk, and that can be reflected in your land use regulations. And so that's really the best available science. Drafting the regulations is kind of the easy part. It's providing all of the background information and all that best available science to support it, just so you have a nexus between the regulations and the actual potential for impacts. So.
And just to provide some clarification on why gas stations and Christy Schmidt, planning manager, just to provide some historic background on why dry cleaners and gas stations are historically listed as a contaminant use, because historically, most of the remediation sites within our state are federally, come from either a dry cleaner or from a gas station, just due to past practices and how things were regulated and the opportunity for groundwater contamination.
Okay.
So that's why.
Since we're asking questions along the way, I'll jump in. Full disclosure, I own property within that bubble that you just showed on the past slides. So within that area, there are existing businesses that are a tow yard, that are a wrecking yard, that are a sanitation yard, that are our own yard, trucking yard. What is the city's idea of scope, keeping in mind that we are all adjoined by marijuana grow operations, to regulate and overlay what's already been built into that area?
Yeah, and that would be part of this. I mean, a lot of it based on the initial best available science review that's done, and then kind of best practices for how to regulate these types of uses. We absolutely do need to take into account existing uses that are there, that are legal uses, and evaluating their potential impacts, looking at the site history, looking at the way that there is the potential for groundwater flow. Proximity itself is not going to be the only thing. It could be that you have an area that, that water is just not going to travel in a certain direction depending on the existing conditions. And so that needs to be factored in as well. And that's why it's so important to really have very concrete and supportable science and mapping to show, how does groundwater actually flow? This is, I think, part of a larger conversation. We're going to need to start looking at our industrial regulations anyway as part of the 2024 comprehensive plan. We consolidated our industrial zones. So we're going to need to update that with the permissible uses table within the municipal code anyway. We're also looking at doing some sub-area planning within the industrial area. The city council and planning commission have had different ideas about what the future of that area is while respecting the uses that are there now and the employment that they generate. And so these are all going to be conversations, and the community engagement on this, Russ and Christy and I just met to kind of talk about our template for community engagement for all of these code amendment projects. So this is an excellent example of how do we identify stakeholders, how do we identify potentially affected parties so that we can engage them in a meaningful way, get their feedback. We obviously need to get a little bit further into the process to present them with some potential code options, but we do want to make sure that we're engaging them early in the process so that they feel comfortable providing their feedback and they understand that we are wanting to solicit, that we do understand that these have real world impacts on existing businesses, and that we're not just doing kind of flying by the seat of our pants, that we want to make sure that we are incorporating all of their feedback as well.
This is Director Wright, and maybe I can ask a follow-up question of Commissioner Huxford just to make sure that you got the answer I think you were looking for. So if the question you were asking, do these regulations immediately apply to established businesses? No, the city's not going to go out to each business and tell them that they need to bring their sites up into compliance or make any capital improvements. Rather, at the time of redevelopment, addition, major changes, then you would need to bring your site, or at least the new portions of the site, into compliance without knowing what the regulations will look like. But it's not, we're not going out and policing existing businesses that are long established and out of compliance with the new regulations. They would still have a non-conforming status.
I appreciate the clarification.
Yeah, and so obviously a lot of these uses, they're subject to Department of Ecology permits or permits from other agencies. And so there are things in place, obviously, to provide some of that environmental protection. And as Russ noted, they would generally have legal non-conforming status, even if we were to apply development standards or permissible use changes within these areas. But yeah, that's not something that we take lightly, just because this is an important area for employment within the city. And there are a lot of existing businesses there. So kind of just wrapping this up, things to consider when developing CAR regulations is obviously how do we, environmental protection is paramount, but all economic development obviously is incredibly important within the city. That factors in for existing businesses, potential future businesses, the vision for the industrial area, the vision for other areas of the city. How do we engage property owners and other stakeholders within these areas and make sure that they have a voice in the process to adopt these regulations? And then how, using that best available science to manage and mitigate risk based on travel times, site conditions, all of that. That is going to, as I've already stated, that is going to be really front loading this project with all of that technical analysis. The better our technical analysis, the more supportable the potential regulations are, and the better informed the community will be. So as far as what we're doing right now, as I mentioned, we're just starting to finalize a contract with the consultant team to help us with our best available science review and mapping these CARA areas, defining them, categorizing them, which will then provide the foundation for identifying potential lists of either not necessarily prohibited uses, but also regulated uses within these CARA boundaries. Again, there can be different regulations that apply depending on which wellhead protection area, what the travel time is of the potential contaminants. If we don't have any 1, 3, or 5 year wellhead protection areas, and we just have 10-year, based on this use's proximity to larger water systems, that might be reflected in kind of less stringent regulations, as opposed to if you had a large well that served hundreds of people directly adjacent, obviously you're going to need to factor that in to any regulations that you have. So we are required to adopt this as part of our critical areas ordinance, which must be completed by the end of the year, just like a lot of the other comprehensive plan implementation items. The state has kind of originally, they had sought to have cities update this concurrently, but they understood that a lot of cities were having difficulty in doing it while also adopting the periodic updates. So we have been granted until the end of this year. There's still a lot of work to do, but I think we're in a pretty good spot, just given the limited scope of our overall critical areas ordinance update. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions. I know we've had some discussion on the way. If you have general thoughts as far as regulating land uses, what we really should be prioritizing and focusing on, kind of any concerns that you have, happy to take any of that down, but just wanted to start the conversation tonight, get initial input from commissioners, and we'll be bringing this back periodically over the next few months and keeping you apprised of as we complete that best available science review.
Do you anticipate there's any impact to residential areas, or those are already compliant and it's really just the industrial or other areas that you're concerned about?
It's really the more commercial uses. I mean, they're on the residential side. There are activities that might potentially occur within residential areas, but they're not kind of primary residential activities. They're things that if somebody is going to be obviously dumping oil in their backyard or something
Sure.
like that, you can't really protect and regulate that. We already have enough environmental protections to address situations like that. There was some discussion related to critical areas as some of these housing bills have come down the pipeline over the last few years. There were generally concerns about, well, if you're increasing density, how is that going to potentially impact things like CARAs? In general, I mean, even with allowing the increased density, we're still maintaining generally the same maximum impervious surface areas, the same stormwater management requirements, basically treating duplexes and triplexes the same as detached single-family residences when it comes to that, and it's based on the zone as opposed to the use. So generally, the increase in density doesn't have really shouldn't have an adverse effect on things like CARAs because all of the underlying development standards are still consistent with the historic uses within these areas.
Okay. And then when you talk about you're still finalizing the scope of work and outreach plan, meaning, do you already know what questions you're going to ask the community? Like I'm saying, do you know what feedback you're looking for already, or are you still trying to figure that out?
Yeah, I mean, we're developing we need to develop the engagement plan. And so if there are any we have not finalized it in any way. So if there are thoughts from commissioners, things that you'd like to make sure that we're asking the community, engaging the community on, we definitely can, we would love that feedback.
And that's another big reason we're bringing a consultant on. So we have a technical expert in that field that can really help guide us in the right direction before we do commence with that public engagement.
Thank you, Commissioner Packard. Are there any other questions that are, I wanted to make sure that we noted that it was you that was asking those questions.
This is Commissioner Jennifer Davis, and I had two questions. One, with regard to public engagement, I'm curious if the number of affected stakeholders is small enough that the targeted mailing option is, we discussed this early this year or maybe late last year, that seemed to be one of the more effective. Honestly, just old fashioned postcard in the mail seemed to be pretty effective in getting people to come to our public hearings. So I'm hoping that it's a small enough group that it makes sense to potentially implement that. And then my other question was, for timeline, needs to be done by December 31st, but what could we expect to see like the next time it comes to us? Because this was a great overview of it, but the next time we are presented with this, will it be post consultancy? How will that roll out, I guess is my question.
Yeah, so I think the project is going to need to be, the immediate tasks that need to be taken care of, that need to be completed are obviously kind of that best available science review that basically where the consultants are going to be mapping these areas. Really the mapping and the calculation of potential travel times is really important as far as establishing, hey, what are we looking at as far as how we need to regulate these uses and how we need to regulate these areas? If you know, depending on what that the conclusion of that work, that's going to influence kind of how strict or how lenient we can be, for lack of a better term, what the regulations need to look like. And so I think the first things that would come back to you would probably be the engagement plan, just to kind of run that by you. And then also some of the initial best available science, just so that we can document what is supporting some of the engagement and some of the initial thoughts on how to regulate uses. Those are probably the two main things that would come back to you first.
And maybe I can take a step back on that answer just a little bit. So don't forget, this is a larger project that's updating our entire critical areas code. So even though Dave is introducing this piece first, it's probably going to take the longest to complete. So along the way, we'll be bringing you back more of those rote pieces. Like when we go through the wetlands chapter, there's new guidance from the Department of Ecology that we'll have to integrate that differs from the last iteration. There's new guidance from the Department of Fish and Wildlife, as Dave mentioned, for stream buffers. So we'll be bringing you those pieces along the way too, but this piece that takes the new analysis and that's new work will bring you key points, but don't forget that it's part of a larger body of work, and those will probably be what staff is focusing on, because there's going to be some general cleanup across that entire chapter, as well as, like I say, updating the best available science in at least two of these other areas as well. So.
This is Commissioner Packard again. Commissioner Davis, I originally agreed with you on the mailing. I guess we can't do that exclusively though, right? Because while those people in that area may be the most affected directly if there are restrictions imposed on their properties, there may be a number of people in the community who are concerned about just the environmental impact. And yeah, maybe it's not their property, but they might be passionate about what regulations are imposed on them, and et cetera, et cetera. So we'll need to be cautious to make sure that there is broad communication.
Mr. Morton,
No,
any comments?
No, I'm good.
I have a couple follow-ups, and one is that I understand that this is a broader scope and that we're using this as an example of a location in the city that might be more impacted or could be used as an example. But we also have developments going on around the lake that are off-putting current water wetlands and mitigating them to other places. So to your point, I don't think that this is just an industrial district issue. But what it does to the industrial district, there's a couple different things. One triggers another. And I think that we should be very cautious in asking the stakeholders there, because we've already implemented a couple different asks of them over years that have either come to fruition or not. And I would just be cautious on what we approach them with and how we approach them at this point. And then the second point is that any sort of change in regulation triggers Department of Ecology, triggers wetlands, triggers other things that are unbeknownst to the city. But you have businesses out there that are now going to be in the crosshairs of other regulatory bodies in the state. And I would be careful of that in how we approach those businesses.
Yeah, no, I think that's very good feedback, and we appreciate that as staff. And it's hard for us to, say we need to develop kind of a comprehensive engagement plan that's also flexible depending on, it could change depending on what the technical analysis shows. I mean, it, it's kind of this cascading effect. Your technical analysis potentially affects the regulations, and that affects how you engage the community, how you have that discussion. So we're wanting to have something, that is responsive to community concerns, that reflects best available science and all of that. But we understand that there has already been a fair amount of engagement. Some of these areas are, a bulk of the industrial area, obviously, especially the northwest portion of it, has been in the city for a while, but there are relatively newer properties in there as well, and just haven't really been used to dealing with the city. So making sure that we're sensitive to that as well, as far as just having those conversations and trying to continue to build those relationships with the business community out there within the industrial area. So, I think it's an exciting project. I think it's an important project, but there are a lot of nuances that we're going to need to consider as we develop the scope and the outreach.
When should we expect? So the question was asked before, and it's a broader question because I know that you're bringing on a consultant and we don't know when they'll bring their findings back, but this is one that I don't want to be pressed to December to vote on. When should we expect something back that we are actually getting public comment on and voting on?
Yeah, and so I'm going to be talking with the consultants tomorrow. Just to discuss scope and schedule, just to meet that December 31st adoption, recognizing that we do not want to obviously be holding public hearings in early December, because then that doesn't really leave any, one thing that came out of the Snohomish County process was that they had the process and then they thought they were basically ready to adopt, and then it kind of circled way back towards almost the beginning, and they had to kind of reconvene and rethink their strategy. So we do want to provide that flexibility and try to get to it as early in the fall as possible, recognizing that it's obviously already early May. And so, that's something that probably need to report back to you on, and happy, once we have that initial conversation, either sending that out via email, kind of initial thoughts on the schedule. But we recognize that this is an important topic that we need to build in a little bit of a buffer in the schedule for the potential need for, a couple different meetings, both at the Planning Commission and the City Council, just at the hearing stage. And that's for as Russ mentioned, this is not just the CARA component. This is, there are some new regulations related to buffers. There are some new regulations on riparian areas and how we have to factor in things related to tree heights and their proximity to riparian areas and how they function within these areas. And so there are some new components that we haven't had to do before. And so we want to make sure that we have plenty of time to walk both the Planning Commission, the City Council, and the community through this, because these are new regulations that are in place, and we want to make sure there's plenty of time to absorb them.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Hearing none, let's move on our discussion. So we're going to do 5B, potential code and design guidelines, revisions to comply with the House Bill.
House Bill 1293.
Sorry, I shouldn't show my disdain. 1293, House Bill 1293. How are we going to accommodate our new legislation?
Yeah, so that's what we are here to talk about tonight. So again, David Levitan. So again, this is another item we've kind of touched on briefly as part of our larger discussion of the process code updates. That originally Melissa had brought back before you about a year ago, but wanted to touch on this one. So this is basically House Bill 1293 was part of the 2023 legislative session. Basically, as adopted and signed by the governor, it states that cities may only apply clear and objective regulations related to the exterior design of a new development. So city needs to make sure that all of their design regulations, as they're structured, allow for applicants to easily interpret them and determine whether their design is permitted, that it's not like a maze or a puzzle or really a mystery, that you can look at those guidelines, you can look at those standards and say, hey, if I do this and this and this, then I'm going to be compliant with the city's design guidelines or design standards. And I have a reasonable expectation that I'm going to be able to move through the permitting process in a rather expeditious way. So the other component, besides having those clear and objective guidelines, is also that it may not result in a reduction of density, height, bulk, or scale. So basically the legislator not wanting local jurisdictions to use this design review component to try to limit projects. It's intended to help to streamline projects, especially, you know, both on the residential and the commercial side of things, as opposed to it's to encourage development as opposed to hamper development. And then one of the the last component of this is that design review must be conducted concurrently or otherwise logically integrated into the development review process. And so we do that now. The Growth Management Act and the city's municipal code does have specific language about consolidated reviews. And this is making sure that the design review components of your municipal code, of any design guidelines that you've adopted, that it does reflect that intent to have this through a streamlined and consolidated approach. And so this is some of the items that we are already looking at as part of the larger process code update. Our code is a little bit convoluted in different sections. It can be hard to follow. So there's an opportunity here to reflect these 1293 requirements into a much better integrated and more streamlined code. And so that's something that this is a component of that. Similar to the critical areas ordinance, it had originally, the deadline had been June 30th, but the Department of Commerce has indicated cities that update their code by the end of the year will be considered compliant for all of these different development regulation updates that came out of the 2024 comp plan update. So again, we're going to need to complete this by the end of the year. So how does Lake Stevens currently regulate design review? So there are a couple areas. So within 1416C, which is land use applications, basically the land use applications and kind of approval criteria for different types of land use applications within the city. That's within section 1416C050. It establishes design review applicability and process, and then references the design guidelines. We're in a pretty good spot on this one as well, because back in 2019, we had updated 1416C050 and adopted these design guidelines. A lot of it was focused on the sub areas and really encouraging and streamlining the development process within those sub areas, but it also applies citywide to multifamily residential, civic, institutional uses, commercial uses, industrial uses. It's not just limited to the sub areas. It applies to basically most things other than single family residential. So when we updated that, there was a conscious effort. The city used to have a design review board. That was not an administrative process. That took some public meetings and reviews. It added another layer of complexity and review to the development process. The city deliberately made design review administrative in nature to try to streamline and try to provide those clear and objective standards. We adopted the design guidelines, which are guidelines, but if you look through them, and that's included as attachment to the ones that are specifically associated with exterior building design, I would consider almost all of that, if not all of the sections, would be generally compliant with 1293. We're going to go through that process and do some initial analysis, but if you have a guideline that says if you do this and this and this, that meets the intent of 1293. If a developer or an applicant, a homeowner can look through that and say, hey, if I do this, then I'm going to be able to be deemed compliant with design review standards and guidelines within the city. I think we are largely already compliant. So it's just making sure a lot of the focus on this, we've done an initial analysis of the code sections, and that's included in attachment 1 of your packet. I think there's, as indicated in the track changes, it's pretty limited as far as the sections of the municipal code that need to be updated. There might be a couple of items that we can revise within the design guidelines, but we're in a much better situation than a lot of cities that have done design review and required multiple public meetings. One of the components of House Bill 1293 is just to provide accountability and to provide a process that applicants can rely on, is to not, cities and local jurisdictions are not allowed to require more than one public meeting. The way that design review currently works in Lake Stevens is design review is a type 1, but there is a notice of application that goes out, and there is an opportunity for the community to request a public meeting to discuss. We very rarely have those. I don't know if Christy, if you had really, you've had a couple of them?
Yeah, I've had a couple.
We've had a couple of them, but it's not kind of the norm. It has to be specifically requested. But so one of the minor changes that we propose to the code is just to clarify that you can only have that one public meeting, and that's to show compliance with House Bill 1293 as it amended the Growth Management Act. I can't think of any projects where we've had more than one public meeting where it had to be continued or where somebody requested another, but the House bill specifically says just to provide that clear and objective process, and that that process that people can really understand what's involved with it, that there aren't all these subjective meetings that are applied at any point within the design review process. So as I mentioned, we had updated this back in 2019, eliminated the design review board. And so I think that's reflected in the quality of the regulations and the quality of the standards and guidelines right now, and why we're in a pretty good spot and don't have maybe the heavy lifting that some other jurisdictions have. So attachment 1 shows some of the preliminary items that we've identified for potential updates shown in track changes. So that includes giving a general definition of design review, most notably as it relates to building design and the intent of House Bill 1293, clarifying that design review shall occur concurrently, shifting it to an associated land use determination just to really demonstrate that relationship as a concurrent land use application as opposed to a standalone one, that this is something that is required as part of a larger development process and that it's integrated in as an associated land use determination, still through that type 1 process, emphasizing the clear and objective nature of the design regulations, removing any subjective terms and code language. There are certain, there are a lot of cities where just things like neighborhood character and all of this, that is more appropriate for your comprehensive plan than in your development code, because that is a pretty subjective term. So going through that, you can still have it as long as it's defined in specific standards or specific guidelines that show somebody, well, how do I get to a point where I'm doing this? You still need to have those more prescriptive and clear and objective standards and regulations, and then clarifying that no more than one public meeting can be required. And as mentioned, our initial assessment of the existing design guidelines show that those are largely compliant. I think there's a couple of tweaks that we can make to the design guidelines to be a little bit more clear and objective. But when it comes specifically to the things like ground level details and massing, building materials, signs, multifamily, basically things that are the exterior design of a building, there is pretty clear guidance, even though they're guidelines and they're not always specific standards. It says if you do this and this and this, or you're required to incorporate 3 out of these 7 principles. That would be considered clear and objective, because if you follow the guidance, follow the guidelines, then you're going to be able to get to the point of approval. And so as far as questions for the Planning Commission, so we've included as attachment 2 the kind of the applicable sections of the design guidelines. We've identified some potential changes to the development code within Title 14, primarily within 1416 CO50, but other associated sections as well. Are there any additional changes? Are there suggestions for how we can kind of better modernize and better, present a clear and objective process, clear and objective standards? And then the level of community engagement. There's been a lot of interest from the Planning Commission and making sure that we have appropriate community engagement for all of these different code amendments. I think this one is a little bit more limited in scope just because the scope of changes that are required are relatively limited. We probably don't need to have the level of engagement that we need for other projects, but what would you like to see on a project like this, just as we start to move forward? And again, similar to the CARAs and its relationship with the overall critical areas ordinance update, this is just one component of kind of the larger process code update. And so we are going to be developing a larger engagement plan because there are going to be some additional items that change as well. But people are generally less interested in the nuts and bolts of how land use review processes go than, say, potential impacts to groundwater supply. That's a much more substantive and kind of, clear, easy to digest issue than, well, now this is going to be type 1 with clear and objective standards. I'm not convinced that a whole lot of people are going to be concerned about that. So just any thoughts from the Planning Commission on the engagement side as well?
Can I ask This is Jennifer, Commissioner Jennifer Davis. I had a question actually on the topic of public engagement, but it's more substantive, and it's on page 10 of the packet, 10 of 38, I think. Anyway, it's in this box. It talks about the different permit status types and the existing timelines versus the new timelines. And I noticed that the first two, type 1 and type 2, the new timeline will be, it'll be a quicker turnaround. But then the third one that involves the hearing is actually expanding the timeline. And is that, I'm wondering if that is in order to provide the more opportunity for the public to be aware of a hearing coming and to reach out, or I'm just curious about the difference there.
Yeah, and so that's not a kind of the primary focus of 1293. I was kind of given a summary of the Senate Bill 5290, which we were already required, and so we have our interim ordinance that has adjusted our timelines to match these state timelines. But yeah, the thought on that is that there used to be just this shoehorn approach where there was no differentiation between type 1, type 2, type 3. This now recognizes that it does take longer when you're required to do a notice of application, you're required to do a notice of public hearing, you're required to do a notice of decision for things like type 3 application. That pushes out the timeline, and kind of the cities, at the state level, that was factored into the actual timelines. And then there's all sorts of requirements within Senate Bill 5290 to show your processes as far as how they contribute to your ability to meet the Senate Bill 5290 timelines. But yeah, kind of circling back and to give you a more direct answer, yes, it's to reflect the different levels of complexity and the different levels of review that are associated with these different land use application types.
Okay.
And if I could just add something, Christy Schmidt, Planning Manager, is that the type 3 often have, as Dave was pointing out, concurrent reviews. So we have more than one application being processed with them.
Mm.
So that's also one reason for the extension in time.
Okay, I got a question. This is Bruce Morton. So is this for commercial only properties? Because I don't see anything in here about residential.
It applies to multifamily residential
Oh, okay.
design review.
All right. So the just to give context, or in the recent history, especially since 2019, has design review, how often does design review fail, or does anyone fail design review?
Yeah, if you'd like to answer.
I wouldn't use the word fail. We work with the applicant to achieve compliance. So at first they may submit a design that's not fully compliant, but staff provides comments back to them and then they revise their application in order to obtain approval. Does that make sense?
So, yeah, so, and how far out of compliance are these? Do they end up being little tweaks here and there, or?
Typically, it just depends on the applicant. Sometimes they have a different vision in mind than really what's required, but our prescriptive design regulations make it very simple to follow. A pitched roof is an example, an awning. Those are very qualitative things that you know exactly what they are and an architect is. So very often it's not a complete major rehaul.
Okay. Yeah, the reason I'm asking is because part of this, implementing this part of 1293 is to make it so that there's less subjectivity, less abuse of regulations to achieve other means, to limit growth. And I don't get the sense that that's really a problem here. And so I'm not really worried about this. I do like this, that there's big paragraphs that are like hugely subjective, like this one paragraph on page 14 of 38, paragraph 6, that's like, you read that and it's like, that is completely subjective. I'm glad to see that going away. But there's a few other things that are subjective that are left in here, and that's and I guess there's no way you can get rid of it completely, but I think that this is all really good, and and as far as your questions about whether to have public engagement, I would think that public engagement would really be needed when you're increasing regulations, imposing more restrictions. I think the purpose of this law, which is sadly rare, is that it's a law to make things easier, less regulatory. You know, the state's imposing deregulation on cities to make things more streamlined, and and so I don't think there's a really need to engage the public on things that are to make things easier, because I don't think there's going to be any objective. I doubt that there's going to be anybody that's saying, no, we need to make things more difficult. So that's just my opinion. Thank you.
Commissioner Packard. I'll just say it. So when I read this, it almost seems like a user's guide to how to set up a successful business, right? Like, hey, you should have flashy signs. You should have lots of windows. I guess I'm a little bit opposite you. I think there's too much in here. Like, it's too prescriptive as far as I would see from the standpoint of every single section, your plants, your windows, your facade, right? It's more than I would have expected, I guess. So my question is that because we feel like that level of detail is needed to be compliant with the code, the law, or because we're trying to protect ourselves as a city to ensure that what gets put in a business or whatever is what we want it to be?
I can answer that one as the primary author of the design guidelines.
Okay.
So the design guidelines we had before that were pretty poor. There were a lot of illustrations. So it was a conscious attempt, actually, I would say sort of ahead of this type of legislation, to provide enough level of detail and prescriptive standards that gave an applicant a menu of options. And as Dave sort of suggested, a lot of the language will say, if you do 2 of these 3 things, you're compliant. So yeah, it serves dual purposes, that we have a vision for how we want the community to look and what the community expects to have attractive businesses. And I think what you said also is true, that it does help businesses be successful if they're also attractive. So it's trying to find that balance, but by being very detailed, again, it's more of this menu option. So if you talk about landscaping or parking lots, you can achieve the same thing, but you have 3 ways you want to do it. So that allows, a business owner to decide, hey, this is what works best for for me, but it's not to the point that, again, when we were having design review board meetings, where usually you did have a landscape architect, an architect, maybe a graphic artist, and then a lot of your discussions would revolve around more of these subjective issues, color preference for a different type of siding. And all we're saying, say with siding, is give us 2 different types of siding to make your building interesting. And so that was sort of the approach. Definitely, there are probably some areas we can go back and revisit. And I actually have a couple in mind that I would like to change, like in there. And this actually came from an architect where we even drilled down on the pitch of a roof. Things like that, I think we should probably remove. I don't care if you have a 12-2 or some other roof, as long as you've modulated your roof line. So there are some that are probably too prescriptive.
Okay. And then the categories, entrances, weather protection, et cetera, are those specific categories that the law says we need to provide some definition around, or we came up with those categories
Oh,
ourselves?
no, those were the city's desires to have those types of guidelines and looking at those specific areas of buildings or architectural elements. That has nothing to do with sort of the current
Okay.
legal framework.
Yeah, just to clarify, the design guidelines predate the legislation by
Okay.
about 4 years. But so if we do have these guidelines and they are categorized like that, then anything that's related to the exterior design, we need to make sure that those standards or guidelines are clear and objective. So there is the possibility that, it could be on opposite sides of the spectrum. It's not clear and objective enough, or we feel like it's almost overly prescriptive. And so that would be a different issue. That wouldn't be a House Bill 1293 issue. That would be more a general how the guidelines are implemented issue.
Okay, and then I have one last question. So let's say a business comes to us with an idea that isn't within this framework, but we like it. Is there an exception process, or do you have to then say, hey, we're going to have to bring that to the city council? They're going to have to approve an amendment. I mean, how much flexibility do we have to say, hey, actually, that's a better idea than what we'd thought of before?
The first chapter of the design guidelines explicitly talks about exceptions and alternatives to the design guidelines. So there is a process
Okay,
identified.
So we're required to provide them with clear and objective standards. That doesn't preclude us from having the opportunity for them to propose something else. They just have to have that opportunity to be, hey, if I do this and this and this, I'm going to be compliant with design review. That doesn't mean that they can't propose something else and allow us to evaluate that.
Yeah, I agree that less prescriptive is better, but I think that, what they have in there is it's a design floor. They could be a lot more like thankfully they're not in there saying all new buildings must be Tudor style or Elizabethan with columns or something like
Some
that.
cities do.
Yeah,
Some
exactly.
cities do. They do have a theme.
Yeah, and so we're a themeless city, thankfully. And so we can progress with as things go forward. And so, yeah, I'd say, yeah, so the more you can take out, the better. But of course, we need to have some sort of floor because, there may be some businesses which may want to put up a straight up steel building with no facade, but that's possible, but probably not likely. And that's why I asked, how often people get rejected. No one's going to do that because they have pride and they want to have something that looks nice. So,
Yeah, we definitely we have applications that it takes several iterations, that it starts with basically a flat building with no articulation, no modulation, and then we gradually just have to, sometimes not so gradually, kind of drag them along to compliance.
okay, so there are instances like that.
I think, this is Jennifer Davis. I think that we are aiming for the sweet spot between not faux Bavaria, but also not Aurora Avenue. So
If only. This is Janice Huxford. So I would just caution again, as we move forward, that two things, the city doesn't have to be the poster child for adopting everything that comes out of Olympia, nor should it, please. I think that we've done a great job in setting the standard here already. The second thing is that some of this legislation that's coming out that we're going to see imposed upon us shortly is done for the entire state, not necessarily for our city specifically. So I like the idea that it is going to be mitigated as much as we can as a city. But also having been someone that's gone through this process as an existing business, it was very cumbersome to meet the requirements of that time. And again, this has been a while, so I'm not bringing up current conversations, but the idea of trying to expand and entice other businesses in our area was met with resistance and to a point where we were not able to expand. So I want to make sure that we're being cognizant of not only new businesses that are coming into town, new structures, new multifamily, but the existing residents and business owners that are here that are having to meet all of the new regulations to do anything that they want to do to continue to be viable in Lake Stevens. So I would just offer that up as consideration as we move forward with this. Are there any other comments? So where do we take this?
Yeah, so this, I think we'll come back with, this is a component of the process code where this, there are larger changes, especially to chapters 1416A and 1416B as well. So we'll work on developing a schedule for that kind of larger project and bring that back and give an update on this. I think what I'm hearing, we appreciate the feedback and the concerns. I didn't hear anything, any fire alarms going off as far as things that absolutely need to change with them. And so we're going to continue to evaluate them. As Russ noted, there are a couple things within the guidelines that I think are just can be deleted or revised, amended. So we'll continue to identify those things and brief the Planning Commission through periodic work sessions before we come back as part of the public hearings for the larger process code. But we're going to be bringing back additional housing related items. We have the step housing that needs to be completed by the end of the year. And so that's kind of peripherally related to this, some of the development standards associated with that. And then there are some other housing implementation items as well. So I think there will be an opportunity to give updates on this component as part of the larger housing and design review changes that we need to make.
Can all of those be condensed in a way that is so that we're not trying to reach out to people that don't understand this and are not engaged in this process day to day? But is there some way that it can be captured as a whole?
Yeah, no, we can definitely work on that and, try to identify areas that we think would be maybe of the most public interest and things to really focus some of the engagement on. I think there's going to be feedback on some of the critical areas work. There's going to be feedback on some of the emergency and transitional housing work that we're required to complete by the end of the year. And so, yeah, we can work on condensing that and kind of packaging it in a way that, it's not so disparate in all of these individual topics that try to explain the relationship, all these things that really it's about, providing opportunities for input while also creating these clear and objective standards that, can be manifested and help to create the vision of Lake Stevens that, the city council, the planning commission, the community at large has. So we can work on that, work on building out the website, building out the engagement plans, and just so it doesn't seem so disconcerted that it seems like it's a holistic package.
Any other questions or comments? Is that
That is great. Thank you. Yeah, appreciate it.
Questions?
Thank you.
All right, we are at 7:12. At this point, without conversation from Commissioner Connor Davis, Don, may I confirm that you have not been reached out to? He's not communicated with me. Let me double check.
No.
Okay. Do I have a motion to extend an unexcused absence to Commissioner Connor Davis?
I'll move, so.
What does that mean?
I worded that incorrectly. However, we do not have notice from Connor Davis that he was not going to be able to attend this evening. So we need to make a motion to have him deemed unexcused from this meeting. And we have,
Well,
Chair,
I have sympathy because I've been in the same situation.
Right.
I've had unexcused absences in the past.
I
Right.
think we, yeah,
so I know, and we all get there. So, but it is noted. So it is noted for the record. Okay.
I don't think I was, motion.
Okay, so thank you. I will take that off. And now we are going to move into commissioner reports. Commissioner Packard, I was going to ask you to start because you attended a retreat recently. Do you have any reports from that?
Okay, so I will start by saying it was interesting. I enjoyed being there. I was there for my own personal reasons, I'll be clear, but also as a representative of the Planning Commission, right? So I probably would have been in there anyways. Having said that, as far as city business and agenda items, I will just share that there was no interaction between me and the city council, right? When we talked about our involvement, it was, hey, we should go to the retreat, perhaps, right? We can bring some agenda items, et cetera. As far as my formal capacity as a planning commissioner member, there was no interaction. Now, I'll be very clear, everyone was very friendly, they were very kind, they were welcoming, but that was more in a personal interaction and as a citizen as opposed to planning commission. So if our intent was to be there and have planning commission, city council engagement, that didn't happen. I'm not blaming anyone, I'm just sharing with the body that that's how that went. So if we want to change that moving forward, again, I think we need to be more explicit in what we would like that interaction to be. I didn't come away from that saying, hey, I should have been more involved. I'm just wanting to make sure that it was clear how that went down. And if that bothers us, then we need to talk about that. A couple of things that I thought came out of that were interesting for this body. They talked about the vision and mission statement for the city. I'm not sure we need to spend a lot of time on that here or give feedback into what that vision and mission statements are, but how often are we as a planning commission reminding ourselves what those visions and statements are and making sure that the decisions that we make are in line with that vision, right? So I think that could be valuable in us just bringing that up occasionally in this room and saying, how are we doing specific to the comprehensive plan? Are all the things that we approved in line with that vision and the mission statements? One of the things I also thought of was our role in the Planning Commission. How often are we proactive versus reactive? And I've just been thinking about our role, right? Not saying it's bad, and maybe it's just what our RAA is, as we've talked over the last couple of meetings. I don't recall us really bringing anything to the table as a Planning Commission. We bring up items here in this conversation, but we rarely say, hey, we think this should be an agenda item, right? The staff largely presents stuff to us. We read it, we provide feedback. Now, if that's what we want this body to be, and maybe that is the RA of this body, great. But it was just an observation that we're rarely proactive in proposing agenda items. So overall, it was very interesting. I think in the city council meeting yesterday, they reviewed kind of the action items that came out of that. There was some discussion. I wasn't able to attend. I was trying to fix my car. But overall, it was a very interesting meeting. I enjoyed it, and I would attend again.
Thank you.
Do
We
you have
have-
specific questions?
Do I have specific, what, do we have specific questions?
I'm sorry.
No. Well, I guess the first thing that came to my mind is, let's see, a couple of years ago, we had a fairly contentious debate about short-term rentals. Was there any discussion there about the results of, over the last couple of years of that legislation? Is it successful or not?
I'll state something and you can challenge that if you, no, that
Okay.
wasn't brought up,
Okay.
at least not explicitly.
Yeah, just curious.
So that's actually, if I may respond to your first part of your comment. So last I heard on the topic was that and the planning commission was willing to submit topics for us to discuss and when appropriate, and again, consultation with the rest of his team. Invite discussion. To my knowledge, we didn't receive any of those. So, for whatever reason, that's why, we're invited to participate at any point. So if there are future topics like that, again, you might refer to Russ and his team as to what's appropriate and watching lanes, but items like that, if you'd like to see the council discuss those, perhaps involve planning commission members. That's what we've talked about.
Got it. And there were some items that were submitted. Don, I think you received an email from Commissioner Huxford with some things. I guess, again, I'm clearly not blaming anybody or saying this, I was offended, right? Just as we work through the process. I wasn't clear that, yeah, if we submitted an item, that meant that there would be discussion. It was more just, hey, we're hoping that this gets addressed. We just need to talk through what should that process be in the future and make sure that we're clear going in.
I mean, maybe I can just respond quickly.
Sure. Again,
So-
I'm not trying to attack or suggest you need to defend anything.
No, I'm not defending, just for the record, it is the council's meeting and it is a regular meeting for them. It's just an extended meeting that allows them to discuss a variety of topics. So there's really never been an expectation to engage with other board members or the community. But that's, again, it's the council's meeting, so they can decide at what level they want to participate or engage.
Totally fair. Again, just as our body, as the planning commission, if we had expectations for what that is, we should make sure we're clear on that moving forward so that we don't have expectations that don't come through.
May I ask a couple questions?
Please.
And I appreciate you for attending. I'm glad that we have someone in the room. Were speed cameras brought up?
Yes.
And was any revision of the South Lake Stevens Machias Cutoff Road brought up?
That specific intersection? No. No.
Okay. So if I have additional questions on that, hearing nothing from you, I will need to go to one of the city council members.
Great.
Thank you.
My question was answered, Tom.
Thank you for attending.
Yeah. Outside of that meeting, I did just want to address if there's awareness of House Bill 1353 by the city. Does that mean anything? It's recently passed.
Which one is it?
So that one is the related to, well, my paraphrasing of it is the state is suggesting that cities can allow an acceleration of the review process, permitting process, if they are working with an architect who has been
Architect or
deemed
Designer.
trustworthy, reliable, something like that. So just was curious if you've heard of it and if it's been discussed at the city level. I've had some conversations with people. Yeah, we don't know the potential unintended consequences, similar to a comment Commissioner Huxford made earlier. I wouldn't propose we need to jump right in and say, yeah, let's do it. We should be very cautious about how we approach that. Perhaps there's a middle ground of easing our way into that and seeing how things work and giving ourselves space to adjust or recover.
Our building official's been having lots of discussions with the other building officials in the area, and I don't think they've provided sort of a recommendation, but I know we would approach that with great caution because of what we see with a lot of applications, even by qualified architects. They will submit things that are not compliant with code and cuts out the due process for health and welfare, safety, life safety checks that our professional staff does. So I would be very cautious on proceeding with that. But yeah, we are aware of that, and our building official is
Okay.
definitely having those conversations.
Yeah, I'll clearly state, I like the intent, right? The intent is reduce regulation, accelerate the processes, help things move forward faster. If it's misguided, and again, if there are unintended consequences, again, we should be cautious and aware of those. But if there is a way to, again, get some of the value of what that law could provide, I at least just would encourage the city to explore that. And it sounds like you guys are. So that's all from me.
Thank you. Appreciate your comments this evening. Commissioner Morton.
So there's a blog I follow called Permitted with Conditions, and there was a okay, I wasn't sure if y'all familiar with it. And there was a post last month or a couple months ago talking about childcare deserts, and that the Snohomish County has recently passed an ordinance making zoning or the building or permitting of child daycare centers much easier in the county. And my question is that something that has already been addressed in the city, or is that something that will be addressed in the city? Because one of the things that's mentioned in this blog post is that Lake Stevens is very much a childcare desert.
So a couple of things on that. Number one, it just became state law. So it's a moot point at this point. All zones other than industrial zones now will be allowed to have childcare
Okay.
centers. But we have been approached by an individual before the state law passed that was interested in doing that. The difference between sort of the state law and what Snohomish County did, that was really geared specifically towards child care, early child care. And the sort of person that had approached us wanted to expand that to also include like preschools, primary schools. So that's when we bring that back in front of the Planning Commission, that may become an addition to this year's work program, or it'll definitely be part of next year's work program. You would have to make that decision if you wanted to just strictly follow the new state law or expand that to, like I say, some primary or a preschool type functions.
My gut would be to expand it as much as possible. But yeah, I'm glad that there'll be an item of future discussion.
And that is definitely, I would say, warranted, because as we've seen over the past, I would say 8-10 years at different cities through permitting, Christy Schmidt, planning manager, that we have seen an increase in home occupation, childcare centers, and same with adult family homes, a huge increase. So that goes to show the need is there, and that's what derived the legislative change.
That's all for me.
It's interesting that you bring that up because some of us were part of the whole conversation where it buffers up to now pot grow. And so you can't have, this because of this. And so it's, yeah,
I can imagine.
yeah, it's been fun.
What's that smell, mommy?
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, Commissioner Jennifer Davis.
Mine is really a kudos. I've had the opportunity recently to utilize some of our new bike lanes, and they're probably not even that new anymore, but they were new to me, and I was overjoyed to be able to safely ride my bike around town and made it all the way to downtown from my home on the other side of Highway 9. So it's great. I'm happy to see that multimodal coming into action.
Get closer.
And if I were ever to get a tattoo, it would be intent. And the other one would be unintentional consequences, unintentional consequences. I think those two things feed into a lot of what we deal with as planning commissioners volunteer as we are, and what the city is doing when it comes to absorbing what's being handed from Olympia. So I appreciate everybody's awareness of some of those new bills that are being signed. And over the next couple of weeks, months, and years, seeing what those will become in our city. So thank you for keeping aware. I really appreciate that. It's hard to do, and most of our citizens don't. So it's on us to help them when they ask us questions. Thank you very much. All right, with that, we'll turn the time over to the planning director, Director Wright.
Yep, thank you. I didn't have any specific comments tonight. You've heard about the council retreat. So really just I can give you a quick recap of that. As you heard about, the traffic cameras was a point of discussion again. Talked about some different capital facilities going on, and then there was a budget primer of where we're at and where we're going. So not a super contentious meeting, but lots of great discussion. And beyond that, if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to try and answer any that might be out there.
Can you answer anything about traffic cameras?
Very little. What would you like to know? If you have a specific question, so the council's
I do.
discussed it a
Are
few
our city
times.
parks being identified as locations for traffic cameras?
Right now, school zones and school sheds, so the walking zone around schools would be the primary targeted areas. And in the future, the secondary area to be discussed would be park zones. But right now, the focus would be on the school zones.
And timeline on that?
I don't know what the timeline is to roll it out.
I did have a follow-up question connected to that. How easy is it to move them? Meaning, it's quickly going to become summertime and schools zones aren't going to be applicable, right? Can we put them near the parks for the existing summer and then transition them come the
I
fall?
can't answer that question. I'm sorry. I don't have those technical details.
Okay.
And just anecdotal, as I was driving here, someone was trying to back out of Sunset Beach. So we have invested in that beach. That is a beautiful piece of public property to get to the lake. And with cars coming, they can't back out. And so I slow down and I've got someone that's going to rear end me to allow them out. Anecdotal, but true as of an hour and a half ago. Anything else?
No.
Greater good? All right. With that, folks, we are at number 8 on our agenda. That is a motion to adjourn. Who could I have that from?
So moved.
And a second. All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. That would be Commissioner Davis, Jennifer Davis, and Commissioner Morton seconding. Thank you.